Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, a world-renowned strategist and a good friend to the Chinese people, passed away at the age of 100. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a message of condolence to U.S. President Joe Biden, saying Dr. Kissinger made historic contributions to the normalization of China-U.S. relations, and his efforts not only benefited the two countries but also changed the world. Dr. Kissinger's dedication to this cause was evident in his more than 100 visits to China over half a century, with the last trip taking place only last July, shortly after his centennial birthday. During this visit, he reaffirmed his commitment to enhancing mutual understanding between the peoples of America and China. So what made Dr. Kissinger the person he was? Can we have more Kissingers in the future? I'm pleased to be joined from Maryland, the U.S. by Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies, and from Washington, D.C., Victor Gao, Chair Professor at Soochow University. Gentlemen, welcome to the point. First, here is what President Xi said in that message of condolences. He said, on behalf of the Chinese government and people, and in his own name, he extended profound condolences and expressed sincere sympathies to Kissinger's family. In the message, Xi said Kissinger was a world-renowned strategist and an old friend and good friend of the Chinese people. Kissinger had made it his lifelong pursuit to promote the development of China-U.S. relations and enhance the friendship between the two peoples, and his name will always be associated with China-U.S. relations, Xi said. He also added that China is ready to work with the U.S. to carry forward the cause of friendship between the two peoples and promote the sound and steady development of bilateral ties. Victor Gao, let me go to you first. How do you look at the importance that the Chinese president is attaching to this towering figure?
Thank you very much for having me. I think President Xi Jinping's letter of condolence expressed to President Biden of the United States is a firm indication of Chinese government's and Chinese people's appreciation for all the good things that Dr. Henry Kissinger had done to promote peace and cooperation between China and the United States. Ever since 1971, for decades, Dr. Henry Kissinger has brought a high level of pragmatism, realism, and audacity and courage and vision and wisdom to nurture the China-U.S. relations, either during honeymoon period or years, or when relations get really stressed out. Now, I think Dr. Henry Kissinger's consistency in promoting peace and in advocating that peace should be in the mutual benefit of both China and the United States should be the everlasting legacy that he has left, not only for China and the United States, but for the whole world. And I think when we express our condolences for Dr. Henry Kissinger's passing away, we should also celebrate his great achievements as a statesman, as a top diplomat, as a great historian, and as a realist in seeing through the true nature of China-U.S. relations, because he believed that peace and cooperation, mutual understanding between these two great countries and the two great nations of the Chinese people and the American people are not only for the good of China and the United States, but for mankind as a whole.
That's exactly why we're doing this episode, and I choose this particular angle, what made him the man he was. And I want to just go through very quickly, for those who probably didn't know so well his life story. Dr. Kissinger was born Heinz Alfred Kissinger in May 27, 1923, now in Germany. And after fleeing Nazi regime in 1938, Kissinger and his family found refuge in the U.S., where he later became a naturalized citizen in 1943. During World War II, Kissinger served in the U.S. Army and later in the Counterintelligence Corps in post-war Germany. His academic journey led him to Harvard University, where he earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctor's degree. Subsequently, he became a professor of government and international affairs at the university, where he taught for almost 20 years. In 1969, he was appointed National Security Advisor by President Richard Nixon, and his influence was considered pivotal in shaping U.S. foreign policy during that era. and his pragmatic or realist approach earned him a reputation as a skilled strategist. From 1973 to 1977, Kissinger served as U.S. Secretary of State under first President Nixon and later President Ford. His tenure was marked by diplomatic achievements, including the détente with the Soviet Union. Now, following his government service, Dr. Kissinger continued to wield significant influence on international relations. He authored 21 books, delivered impactful speeches, and provided counsel to some say as many as 12 U.S. presidents. And he was active in China for more than half a century, visiting the country for over 100 times. Mr. Gupta, let me go to you. Exactly what shaped this man?
I would say two aspects shaped Mr. Kissinger. One was he was born at a very difficult time in interwar Europe, when Europe was going through great difficulty, and he understood the dangers of major power competition breaking out into outright war, and the suffering and the tragedy that it constituted for the people of Europe and for the people of the world. That premonition of tragedy remained in him throughout his life, and international relations was never just a profession. It was a calling to seek better relations among the major powers in the world. This has great importance, particularly in the sense, to this extent, that the United States has never had that sort of premonition of tragedy as a young country, which the other great ancient civilizations and countries and continents, China, Europe, have gone through. And that leavened his thought of how he approached international relations. And international relations was never a zero-sum game for him. It was about creating stabilizing frameworks within which countries, major powers, could compete, but that major powers had responsibilities beyond just themselves and their interests. That was one. The other element, which I thought was very important, and which were one of his formative experiences, again, growing up in Europe, schooled in the art of the most successful example of European peacemaking, which was the peacemaking after the Napoleonic Wars. And from that, this is laced right through his doctoral dissertation, which was the basis of how he did foreign policy throughout his life. And that one great goal of his was laced, which was in that dissertation, was that major powers have to get together. They need to transform force into agreement amongst themselves by identifying a legitimate principle of order on the basis of which they can create a loose consensus of the sense of justice in the international system. It cannot be I win, you lose, a zero-sum framework. It needs to be a framework which can be shared by both countries. It cannot be democracy versus autocracy. It needs to be a framework which can accommodate competing sides and help establish a framework that is stabilizing, on the basis of which then international relations can proceed.
Mr. Gao, what is your take on the experiences, or maybe the era in which he was born and in which he grew up? What were some of the most important factors that set Dr. Kissinger apart from his peers?
Thank you very much. I met with Dr. Henry Kissinger back in 1985, and in 1987, he wrote me a letter of recommendation when I applied to Yale University for a doctorate degree. And I met him in his office in Manhattan, and I also attended seminar that Dr. Henry Kissinger chaired when he was the chairman of CSIS. From my perspective, what's really very impressive about Dr. Henry Kissinger is his historical depth. When faced with any contemporary issue, Dr. Henry Kissinger could always bring a very long historical framework, looking into the past, focusing at the present, and projecting into the future. Therefore, he brings multiple dimensions to any issue, whereas many American politicians seem to deal with any issue as if it is the totality of the issue, regardless of the historical framework or the multiple dimensions that any particular issue it may involve. Now, the other thing is that based on his historical depth, when applied to any particular issue, Dr. Henry Kissinger has also the capability to bring wisdom, foresight, vision, courage, audacity to any particular difficult challenge. And that's exactly what he did when he advised President Richard Nixon in opening up the door between China and the United States and completely reshaped the world at that time. And the consequences of opening up China-US relations is lasting till today and will be long lasting into the future. This
Well, some people
exactly
argue,
is what Dr.
Mr.
Henry
Gao,
Kissinger
some
is
people
very good
argue
at.
that Kissinger's role was limited compared to the decision of Mr. Nixon in reaching out to China. How would you say that? What precisely was his role in the détente with China?
I think both President Nixon and Dr. Henry Kissinger were very important in eventually opening the door between China and the United States. But they came back from very different perspectives. I worked with President Nixon when he visited China as a private citizen in 1985. And I think these two gentlemen were very, very different. Dr. Henry Kissinger was a scholar to start with, very much of a historian, very much grained into geopolitics, whereas President Nixon is a very shrewd, sophisticated politician to start with. Unlike many other politicians in his age, Mr. Nixon could also have a very broad historical perspective, but they complement each other rather than
I see.
conflict with each other.
Yeah.
And when President Nixon decided to reach out to China, it took all the wisdom and resourcefulness of Dr. Henry Kissinger to bring all the historical
Yeah.
perspectives, different
Let's
dimensions onto the table to come up with a real action plan to
Let's
get
take
it
a look.
done.
Let's take a look at Mr. Kissinger's take on the future of China in May 2023, when he gave an extended interview with The Economist. And Mr. Gupta, Mr. Kissinger was quoted as saying, "The fate of humanity depends on whether America and China can get along." He was famously saying, "They say China wants world domination. The answer is that they in China want to be powerful." That was his quote. And what is your take on the way he looks at this very important relationship, and what sets him apart from many of his latecomers or peers, and even the strategists, the international relations advisors that we're seeing on the horizon? Are we going to see more Kissinger in the future? Is there another Kissinger on the horizon?
That's a great question. I wish there was, but I don't think I see one on the horizon anywhere. But the greatness of Kissinger, and as Victor also pointed out, was the historical depth that he got to the subject matter. And the historical depth is what informed his ideas about China, that this was a great power which has been great but had also fallen, which had suffered tragedies. And this was a power not out there to become great just to dominate, was just to be powerful so that it would not have to suffer from those tragedies that went before. China doesn't seek to take over the world. China seeks to rise to its natural position so that it can secure itself and radiate peace and prosperity in the Asia Pacific, in Asia and the world. And Mr. Kissinger grasped that, and he grasped that because he came from a different tradition of international relations, foreign policy making and understanding, which is just not there in this day and age in the United States, frankly. But having said that, I will say this: the Biden administration and President Xi Jinping have been making important strides that Mr. Kissinger himself would have been proud to make. Gradually, they're trying to create new guiding principles for the relationship. In the course of framing those new guiding principles for the US-China relationship in this new era, they're also trying to attain some deliverables and create more supple, more firmer political ground on which maybe someday we can have another communique, hopefully.
Maybe Dr. Kissinger will be happy to see these developments. Finally, Dr. Gao, very briefly, he is not a man without controversies. There are people who regard him as a dominating and polarizing force. Do you think some of his decisions were avoidable? Or the consequences of some of his policies? And keep it real short. I give you 1 minute, please.
Yeah. at the time when we all expressed condolences for Dr. Henry Kissinger's passing away, let's focus on his positive contribution, especially in opening up the relations between China and the United States. No one is an angel. Dr. Henry Kissinger is a very practical man dealing with enormous responsibilities when he was in government positions. So let's focus on the positive thing, and let's hope that the best tribute we can play to Dr. Henry Kissinger is for all of us to embrace peace between China and the United States.
Yeah. Well, I take away from him his sentence, I believe now, as I believe 50 years ago, that we can find our way through these difficulties. That impresses me the most. Many thanks to Dr. Victor Gao and Mr. Sourabh Gupta joining us from North America. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, fragile truce between Israel and Palestine comes to an end with possibility of extension. And what role has China played during its November presidency at the UN Security Council?